Okay, so today we are reviewing another lens. This lens is actually like the missing link, if you will, from my current vintage lens set that I have. So if you've been a follower of the channel, you know that I have Canon FD lenses. I've modded all of them for EF mount with cine gears and 80 millimeter front diameter rings on the front. So they're basically acting as a cinema lens set for video. But I have an issue using them on my red Komodo when trying to use the speed booster because the back lens element of the lenses when you focus tends to protrude out the back and hit the lens element on the speed booster, which is kind of a no-go. I'm gonna break a lens or hurt something at some point. So not a big deal. I can just shoot the full sensor of the red Komodo, just super 35 millimeter with an EF to RF adapter. But then I don't get that full frame look, and so my depth of field isn't quite as shallow. Now that's not always important, but recently I was asked to shoot a commercial with the inspiration being of Euphoria season 1, and so we really wanted that full frame look, and I was trying to do that with my camera. So I do have the Canon FD 24mm f1.4, which is kind of like one of my favorite lenses of all time. It's 24 f1.4. That's really shallow for Super 35. f1.4 is very fast. Obviously, if you put that on a full frame camera, it's even faster, but 24mm tends to be a little too wide when it comes to full frame or even sometimes Super 35. So I like to go one focal length farther than that. So if I'm shooting full frame, I shoot on the 55mm f1.2, my Canon 55mm f1.2. I wanted to stick to Super 35, so I wanted to shoot at the 35mm focal length. That's kind of my favorite focal length to get a nice separation from the background and still nice shallow depth of field. The problem is my Canon FD 35mm is an f2. It's really not that fun. It's not that dreamy, wide open when you're not on a full frame camera. So I needed to fill this gap. I wanted to get something that was vintage looking, but could go really shallow on the lens. And it would just be a big bonus if it was cinema house. Well, it turns out this lens does exist. So I asked the company Zhongji to send me the lens to see how it would perform. And I actually got it in a few weeks ago and I was able to use it on this commercial, which I'll be able to show you a couple frame grabs from that here soon. But for right now, let's talk about this lens real quick. So it's actually an RF mount lens, which is perfect for the Komodo. This lens also comes in I believe a micro 4/3 mount and a Sony E mount. It's designed specifically for Super 35mm cameras. Zhongji, I don't speak Chinese, I don't know how to say it. Optics 35mm T1.0. T1.0, that is ridiculous. But if you're trying to achieve the full frame look without a full frame camera, this is how you do it. You just need another stop of aperture, basically. Another couple stops, if you will. So f1.4 or f1.8 versus the T1.0. Now this is T1.0, so technically it should be the transmission of light to the sensor. More accurate markings when you're using a T system over an F system. So the 1.0 is really, really fast, and this is the lens we're going to talk about in today's video. And I want to do something a little bit different. Rather than doing my full review and all these tests, I want to do something a little bit more raw here today. I want to actually put this lens on the camera and show how it performs, and then I'm going to pull the lens off and put on one of my Canon FD lenses to compare, because basically what I'm trying to do is fill the gap in my Canon FD vintage lens lineup. This may be a modern lens, but I'm just trying to fill the gap from a intention standpoint. Like, you know, I still want the 35mm look, but I want it to be really shallow and dreamy. So the idea is that I'm using my Canon FD 24mm f1.4 in conjunction with the 35 T1.0 and in conjunction with my 55 f1.2. So I'm actually just going to start testing out the lens here on the camera, and so you can get an idea of how the lens performs. And I'll show a couple screen grabs from that commercial I just shot with the lens while we go along too, so you can kind of just see how it performs in a very controlled, lit, professional environment. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to present your work online. If you're anything like me, a cinematographer, a filmmaker, you need to present your work online, and Squarespace is a great place to do that. You can build a website from scratch using the custom backend tools, or you can use one of their pre-existing templates to get going. And once you've built the website, what's great about Squarespace is it automatically reformats your site for mobile devices. So no reworking the site to make sure it looks good on an iPhone, which is the place that a lot of people are probably going to find your content anyways. It'll just reformat it for you, making it clean and pretty on a mobile device without any hassle. So whether you just need to show off a project or create a store, you can do that with Squarespace. Click the link in the description to get 10% off, and I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Okay, so I've got the red Komodo set up here, and I'm not using an ND filter because I want you to see the color the best that we can. We're going to compare this to the vintage lenses so we can kind of see how they look. So no ND filter, so I'm shooting at an 11-degree shutter angle right now that's why I might look a little choppy, but that's how I'm able to get the exposure correct on those windows. It's luckily a rainy day here. So I recently used this on an entire shoot. Camera assistant was not loving the T1.0, but you gotta sacrifice to get the look. So let me grab a color chart so we can see the gray and the white to look at the color cast here when comparing it to the FDs. Now they're not going to be exact, but like I said, my idea here is just to fill that void on Super 35. And so far I really like this lens. It's honestly sharp at T1.0. It's not like a lot of things that you would think, this is only a, what, $600, $700 lens. You would think that it would be really gross at T1.0, but actually it really holds up. Some people might even want to put a Pro Mist or a softening filter on here if they want to get even that more kind of vintage look, because the reality is this is not a vintage lens. I'm just trying to fill that gap in my vintage lens lineup. But T1.0 is so dreamy, and 35mm is really the focal length that I like for Super 35. I also like 24 a lot. So let's actually throw on that Canon FD 24mm f1.4. This is the spherical version, not the aspherical version if you want to get really technical. The aspherical version, you know, is going for like 20 grand on eBay right now. Mine is probably worth a little bit more than 10 or something like that. A little bit of scratches on the front of it. I'm trying to get that replaced, the front element, or fixed. So if you know anyone that has a 24 that's broken or has parts, I need that lens, so hit me up if you know anyone that has that available, or if you see one up on a listing for some reason. I just need the front lens element. I don't need the whole casing. I'm probably going to rehouse my 24mm when I fix it. Spend the money to get a proper rehousing on that lens, because that lens is just, I just love it so much. So let's throw the 24 on now. Here, maybe you can look at the bokeh a little bit more. Something also to consider on this lens is it has a pretty nice close focus. Like, I don't know, maybe a foot from the lens here. T1.0, look at that. Kind of see how it reacts when something is focused in the back. It does have lens breathing, like way more lens breathing than my Micas. So it's definitely something to consider as well. Okay, we're gonna throw the 24 on now and compare that to see if they kind of match in the same scenario. What's great about this lens is, you know, compared to the vintage lenses, is that the vintage lens has to be adapted to work in a kind of cinema environment with the lens gears and with, you know, the front. We now have 80mm fronts on this, which is this is actually an 80mm front as well. So they all match. You know, I had to put the EF mount on here and stuff like that. So what's great about the Zhongji, or however you say it, is that it has a proper cinema housing. It's really nice. It's made out of metal. It has the gears for the iris and the focus already. So it's kind of like, I don't know, I prefer it over using these actually. But let's look at the image of this and we'll go from there. So something that's really fun about this that may not pertain to everyone else here, but when I take my 24mm, I put my EF to RF adapter on it, and I put it on my Komodo, this gear that I put on my lens perfectly matches up with the gear on the 35mm RF lens, the Zhongji. So that's completely just by accident, but that makes it complete my set, because I literally can take off the 35, throw on the 24, and the lens gear, the follow focus gear, goes right back on the exact same spot, which is just like, I got super lucky on that, but that was a big bonus for me. I'm sure you don't care. Okay, let's throw this on. And I'm going to open it up to f1.4. Then we get the wide angle of the room here. And then that follow focus gear will just push right back on, no problems. I'm gonna tighten it and calibrate it here. Maybe, there we go. So at f1.4, this lens is so soft. Oh, look at that bokeh though, so nice. But that's kind of the characteristic that you're trying to get. It's rather than putting a pro mist on your lens to decon it, make it softer or whatever, you just shoot on vintage and you just get that characteristic right out of the gate. And the idea is that you're trying to take the edge off the sensor, which is great when you're shooting on a Komodo because you're shooting at 6K. In this case, I'm shooting 4K ProRes just for these tests so I can shoot longer, but the 6K, you know, is crisp and sharp, and this allows you to just kind of take that edge off. I'm a little dark, but I think it's fine. So let's look at the color real quick. I haven't changed any settings on the camera at all. We're at f1.4 versus T1.0. So we're obviously can't directly compare the exposures, but you can see here. Now I found that the FDs tend to be a little, they're neutral actually. I used to think they were warm, but I think that might have just been my ND filter. I realize now that the FDs are actually a very neutral color, you know, more blue than my micas for sure. My micas are much more green yellow compared to the FDs. And I think that the Jonji 35mm is also pretty neutral as well. So these two lenses I use a lot on this last shoot. These are the only lenses I use on this shoot and I'm gonna be able to show some of the images from that now because I don't have full rights of the spots. I don't even have the footage, but I do have screenshots that I was able to grab when I did my dailies and I just did a quick color for Instagram and stuff like that. So you put these lenses side by side, you shoot with them, it's definitely going to translate that they're kind of sort of coming from the same set. Now, if I wanted to fill the hole in my Canon FD lineup, what a lot of people are also using is this old Minolta slash Sony lens. I say old, I think they still make it, but it's a 35mm f1.4 lens, which is a fast 35, which I was looking at those as well, but it's an autofocus only lens designed for Sony E-mount. Like I said, it's a collaboration between Minolta and Sony. I could buy one of those on KEH or something like that for like $500 to $1,200 and fill this kind of hole, but I want that nice manual focus. I want the metal body, you know, and so this Jonji seemed like the right move, and it also can open up even wider to get even a dreamier of a look. Actually, I'm gonna get kind of closer here. The 24, you know, 1.4 full frame, like that's dreamy, that's nice. You're gonna get imperfections. So let's show off this lens for a little bit. I wanna give a little bit more exposure now that we've done those tests. It doesn't sound great. There's clearly like some sort of padding dampener or something in here. You can hear it. Don't love that. It hasn't been giving me any issues on set or anything, but it is something to consider. You can kind of feel that this is a cheaper lens. What I do like about this lens too is it's an 80mm front, which is standardized with all my Canon FD lenses. And then it has a 77mm inner thread, which is just like how I've standardized all my Canon FD lenses as well. And then it has, the focus gears. And also the lens element is really tiny, so it's easy to put things in front of this and not have to worry about your sizing. Like you could go with smaller ND or bigger ND and not have any issues because the lens is so small actually inside the whole housing here. The limitation to this lens is obviously the RF mount. You can also get it micro four thirds and I believe Sony E-mount. Definitely something to consider for Sony E-mount super 35mm cameras or cropped cameras like the A7 IV or something like that. So, but for me with my setup, this is kind of perfect because the RF mount is great, obviously, for the Komodo. And even if when I do eventually get like a Raptor, that's also an RF mount, I can put this on there. I can only use it in the super 35mm mode. But once I get into that territory back to full frame, then I'll want to use my 55mm Canon FD, which is a 1.2, and I love that lens. So this is kind of the replacement for that lens on a super 35mm camera. But on full frame, the 55 is probably gonna be my go-to, and this one will probably go back in a box until I need to use it, or if I'm trying to match a Komodo with it or something like that. And actually, I'm going to put on the speed booster, even though I have issues with that with the 55, and I'm gonna show you what the 55mm looks like in this scenario too, so you can see how they kind of match from the full frame perspective. Got the 55 here. Canon FD spherical 55 f1.2. Super pretty lens. All modded with the SimMod housings. Now what I'm not gonna do is put the follow focus gear on there, even though it does match, because I don't want to ruin. Oh, look how nice that looks. Because I don't want to ruin my speed booster here. Did I tilt up a little bit by accident? I did, just a hair, it's okay. It's okay. So here's a good comparison with the 55. So we're 1.2 with the speed booster, which means we're probably at 0.95 or F1.0 basically. So it should be shallow, and it is, wow. It is shallow. Let's back up just a hair on the focus. So it's kind of long. So, I mean, speed boosted, this is more shallow than the 35 T1.0, which is sad, because this is why this is my favorite. Like, it's so dreamy. We have so much light coming in right now. Actually, let me tone this down a little bit. It's probably more accurate to what we were doing with the 35 T1.0. By the way, I'm using an Aperture Nova P300C, just bounced to my white couch for just a little light. So this looks great. I mean, that's way dreamy, so the 35 T1.0 gets us close, actually more manageable, honestly, because this is just so shallow. Look at this, like in, out, in. If I just sneeze, I'm out of focus. Okay, look at the color here, color differences. I mean, they cut together for sure, from what I can see here. The FDs look a little bit more vintagey. There's a little bit more of this kind of ghosting and double edging you can see, but for my purposes, this really worked out. See, and this is what I was talking about in my last video, my Q&A. It's all about what you're trying to accomplish. So, our inspiration for this commercial was euphoria. I wanted to get as close as I could using my camera, and I couldn't use my speed booster, so I had to shoot Super 35 versus full frame, whereas in euphoria, they used the Alexa 65 and LF for the first season, so they were shooting full frame. And they were using Arri Prime DNAs, which are like the nicest lenses that you can detune, made by Arri, to look vintage. They're not actually vintage lenses, but they're able to go in there and move the lens elements around to give this kind of weird ghosting pattern in the background and stuff like that. But it's on modern glass. So I'm trying to just get as close as I could to that, and that's where that T1.0 came into play. This is awesome. Love this look. I'm gonna get a little closer. So dreamy. 55, it's obviously a little longer than a 35 equivalent. It's crazy. I mean, this is how you want everything to look, right? No, it's probably too shallow, but for commercials, this is really fun. I think for a narrative, this is probably overdoing it, but I probably would still do it because I just like to be different. I don't know. Okay, so some final thoughts on the lens. I really like it. I actually like it so much. It's so surprising that a lens, it's around $700, is so nice. The build quality is not amazing, but it's way better than your standard like stills lens. It has the markings on the side. It's on the operator side and the AC side, I believe, which is good. That's better than my micas, which are just on the operator side. And then you have your, you have your aperture markings over here, which is on both sides as well. So you get those markings on both sides. Super nice. Black and yellow, it's fine. I don't mind how it looks. I do like its size. It's like got enough weight to it where it feels, professional. But then it kind of has these cheap front lens caps, you're kind of just standard push on caps. But I like that the gears fit perfectly. I said this before, my gears fit perfectly with my follow focus with my Canon FD lenses, so I don't actually have to move anything around. I just got kind of lucky on that. But if you do have an RF mount camera like a C70 or the new R7 or an R5 and you want to shoot Super 35 or a Komodo, obviously, this lens, I actually would highly recommend it if you're looking something a bit dreamy but has a nice build quality and you can control it and you don't actually have to shoot vintage. You kind of just get closer to that vintage look. So thanks Jonesy for sending this out to me to try out and test. I really enjoy this lens and I think a lot of other people will too. Jonesy also has some other lenses coming out on the market, some full frame lenses, and then they also have more Super 35mm options coming out soon. So I think there's gonna be a 25 for this, and I believe they're making a 50 for a full frame. And so there's gonna be a lot more options coming from this company, so definitely keep your eye out for this company. Also real quick, I tried to flare this lens on set. I actually used like a 600D, a 1200D with a Fresnel, and I shot it right into the lens, and it really didn't flare that much. It's very controlled lens, whereas a vintage lens might have a lot more flaring going on or blooming going on. So in that case, it's not totally like a vintage lens. Like I said, you might want to put a pro mist on it if you want it to kind of have even more character than it does out of the box. I mean, all lenses do flare. I'm sure it does have some sort of flare, but this one just tends to be pretty controlled. And it probably has a lot to do with, the outer diameter here covering up most of the lens element. But then if you have to get a light basically in frame in order for it to flare a lot. So if you shoot into the sun, maybe you'll see that. I can't test that today because it is raining here in my city, so I can't actually test that unless I break out a Fresnel and shoot it right into it. But I already tried that and it didn't work. So that's just a little side note about this lens. It's very controlled from a flaring standpoint. So obviously, if you want to get closer to this look, you could shoot on a full frame camera, but if you are limited with a Super 35, this is a really good option. And, the reason these come in the Micro Four Thirds or Sony or RF is because of the flange distance. They couldn't probably make this into an EF mount lens without having to extend the body in the back, and they probably didn't want to do that from a manufacturing standpoint because it's easier just to swap the mounts on here for the mirrorless style cameras, and that's why RF is going to start taking over the market versus the old EF mount. All right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I'm Sancho Sakurai. See ya.